I wanted to give you the remaining page of your notes in your notebook regarding what's called interval notation. Interval notation is not in your textbook. This is something that is used to represent the solutions to anything that can be graphed. So inequalities, any other type of functions like linear equations, also parabolas, any other type of equations or functions that can be graphed, you can write the solutions in interval notation. I'm going to ask you to write it in interval notation after you graph it, but know that you could write it in interval notation and then you could interpret the interval notation to determine what the graph would look like. But I'm going to have you do it from the graph after you've already graphed it. Okay, so it's basically just a way of writing the solutions to an equation without having to graph it and writing it in shorthand form. Okay, so a couple of rules surrounding interval notation. The first rule is we are going to write the points in order as we see them from left to right. So here's what I mean by that. If I had a graph and on that graph I had graphed or done an arrow, so this must be an inequality that goes like this. When I am trying to determine what points I'm going to write to represent the solutions, I'm going to go in order from left to right. Well, if I'm starting at the left and coming to the right, the first thing I get to is this arrow. And that arrow is pointing to the left. And so I'm going to call that negative infinity. This is the infinity symbol. It looks like a sideways 8. So I'm going to go down here and I'm going to write that this is negative infinity. And again, that would be this. And if let's say that I had a graph and the arrow was going to the right, obviously it wouldn't be the first point you would come to, but when you got to that arrow, you would see that it is pointing to the right, and that would be considered to be positive infinity. And for that, we would use a positive infinity symbol, so nothing in front of it, okay? Okay, so you write the points in order from left to right. So the next thing I'd come to would be this open circle, and we'll talk about what to do with that, okay? So you do have to check to make sure that you don't have any compound inequalities. Because if you have a compound inequality, you need to know that ahead of time so you know what it's going to look like when you write the points. So if it's an and, you're only going to have one set of numbers, similar to what you would have if you only had one inequality, okay? And if you have an or, you're actually going to have two sets of numbers because an or goes away from each other, which means that you have one graph and essentially a second graph. So you're going to have points for this one and points for this one, and we're going to join them with this strange looking U. That is in set notation. That represents or in set notation. And so that's going to be written there in between the two sets of points that you're going to find. So it's important that you know if you have a compound inequality. And then the last thing is we are going to enclose our points in either brackets or parentheses. And we might use brackets on both ends. We might use parentheses on both ends. So the coordinates might look like this. They might look like this, or they could have one on one side and brackets on the other. And so the way to determine this is determined by two things. Number one, we always have a standard way of doing this for the infinity symbol, okay? So if you are using, if you have an infinity symbol as one of your points, infinity symbols are always going to be included underneath of the parentheses. So I'll put that here and here. Positive infinity and negative infinity would always be next to parentheses, okay? Now, what if it's not infinity? What if it's open circles and closed circles? Well, this makes really sense if you think about what open and closed circles mean, okay? So if you have an open circle, we're also going to use parentheses, okay? So that translates into if you have this sign or this sign. Okay, so let's say that this is an open circle. Let's say that this was the point, I don't know, 5 on the number line. Then what I would write is I would write the negative infinity, whoops, negative infinity, comma, 5. The infinity symbol always uses parentheses, and an open circle also uses parentheses. So this would be the interval notation for that graph. Okay. Now, when do we use brackets? Well, we use brackets when we have a closed circle. Because if you think about it, the closed circle means it includes the answer. So we would use brackets if we had the equal, greater than or equal to, or the less than or equal to symbols. So if you have either one of those symbols, then, so if this had been filled in instead, then instead of using a parentheses, I would have used a bracket. Okay, you don't have to write any of this stuff over here. You're just filling in your notes because we're going to do some examples next. So that's interval notation in a nutshell. But we're going to actually do the interval notation of all of the examples that we did on our other pages in our notes. So in the next video, I will show you how to go back to your solving inequalities page, and we'll do the interval notation for those. And then we will do the interval notation for the absolute value inequalities and the compound inequalities.